but through an encounter with an other. He's more unique, however, in thinking through how deeply we are ethically obligated to these others. In an article on Levinas, the scholar Marie Kuti expresses his often difficult ideas quite clearly, and that's why I'm quoting her and not him. She writes, "For Levinas, every breath I take is a breath that the other cannot take. I am in a fundamental sense always already guilty in that my existence, almost by definition, diminishes the other's chance of survival. The simple fact of my being, my capacity to be, represents an infringement of someone else's being. There is a link between the flourishing of the Western subject and the non-flourishing of the non-Western one." End quote. So to circle back, if the 21st century is indeed going to be the century of the migrant, and it's already presenting us with new kinds of migrants, as Pablo Terrell will discuss in a minute, then we need to think hard about what kind of ethical relationship we want to have to those who move. And I'm hoping that this week will give us that opportunity. Thank you.
I also want to thank Mr. Nagash for accepting our invitation. It's quite a pleasure to have you here. I can't wait for all the learning that's going to happen this week. I also want to thank the Weissberg committee for inviting me to be part of this panel. That's quite an honor. I want to thank the Weissberg Foundation for supporting our human rights program in ways that we couldn't even have anticipated a few years ago. And I want to thank all of you for being here today in this really wonderful spring day. Okay. So I also want to explain that the technical problems we had probably are due to the conversion from Mac to Microsoft. So not to blame my colleague Ed Maston, it's not his responsibility. So the topic of my presentation today is climate refugees, climate change. What happens when changes in climate send people on the go, whether they want to go or not. So I decided to take the perspective of people mostly living in developing countries, what we used to call developing countries, low income, middle income, because they're likely to be the ones who will be most affected by it. So my goal today is to really think about what kinds of legal guarantees do they have to try to find the protections that they're likely to need. And well, this is not breaking news to you. There's a big gap between what the world needs and what the law provides. So that's more or less what I want to talk about. And at the top, that quote about migration, I think I want to highlight, because migration is really important here in terms of the solutions. So what are we talking about? I was looking for data to compare what is an actual refugee to the estimates on climate refugees. And I couldn't find a study. I found this by the International Organization for Migration that goes back to 2008, so don't really take these numbers as being real. But I think what I want to get out of this is the magnitude of the problem. We're talking about potentially 20 million people back in 2008, anywhere between 25 million and a billion by 2050. The most widely studied talks about 250 million. The truth is we don't know, but this is a serious problem coming our way. The term climate refugee has been quite widely used lately. It was first introduced by UNEP, the UN Environmental Program, in 1985. Mostly as a matter of public relations, to call people's attention to climate change, not necessarily to have people focus on climate refugees themselves. So Beth explained what a refugee is, and I think the first thing that I'd like to do is explain why the term climate refugee might actually be counterproductive. So people who are moving because of extreme weather events do not necessarily meet those definitions. They're not running away because they're persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or because of their political opinion. They do not necessarily cross international borders, although they do often. Government is not normally the perpetrator. If there is any perpetrator, it's us, industrialized countries. But when we burn fossil fuels, we didn't do that with the intention of harming people in other countries. So from a legal perspective, the term is not adequate. Some people claim, well, maybe we should broaden it. And what I argue is that that's probably not a good idea. One, because the political climate is not good for that. The international community is very unlikely to want to broaden the term of refugee to make room for potentially millions, if not even a billion. Secondly, because I think the harm that might come from this might be actually greater than the good. We're not really going to be able to grant all of these protections to people moving because of extreme weather events. And we might actually make it harder for people who have a legitimate case under existing legislation. The amount of money, political will, resources, time that goes into the process is huge. We might actually create a much bigger problem that is probably not going to help anyone. So one of the arguments that I make today is that we probably need to engage in some kind of creative thinking here to see what approach we can develop that might be most useful. So we need to think about climate change as something that encompasses rapid onset events, such as the rain that we experienced at around 4 o'clock today, and slow onset events, such as farmers losing their farms in the Midwest because conditions are not appropriate for them to grow what they used to grow over the years. But when we do that, we have to be careful not to engage in cases of environmental colonialism. I said that I was going to take the perspective of people in low-income, middle-income countries. So I've been looking at literature and studies from those countries. None of this is primary research. Unfortunately, I don't have the money to get there. But I've looked at some really interesting studies. The first one is the concept of climate refugee is actually being used as a political weapon, mostly by liberals in Europe and the US, to push their governments into action. That's not necessarily a term that is being espoused by people in developing countries. This is a map of the US. On the left, you see, I think it's your left, you see that most people in the country, regardless of where they live, believe climate change is actually happening and it's going to affect people. The one on the right, your right, basically signifies that most people think it's not going to affect them. So it's going to affect somebody somewhere, but not them. So that, in a way, it's a very interesting manifestation of colonialism in a different ways. Another reason why I don't think climate refugee is a good term is people that might be affected in developing countries believe that it portrays them as passive victims. And they don't want to be thought of people who need to move because they're victims of something. They want to feel they're welcome into communities because they bear skills that are appreciated, that are needed. It denies them of agency. Can't do anything. We need to save them. It gets worse. They fear that if we move people out of the way, we can continue to drill, we can continue to burn. So then they become the problem. And that's not the way they'd like to be thought of. And this is what they think when they hear people in the US and Europe moving them out of their countries, internment, refugee camps. So that's not necessarily what they want. They know people are likely to be there for many years, if not decades. But the worst of all is cultural genocide. They're terrified to lose their culture. They don't want to be a footnote in a history book. That's something that comes up a lot with interviews with people on the ground. So maybe the concept of environmental migrant might be a little more appropriate. As a matter of fact, the concept actually, I think, carries a lot of weight. This is a definition by the International Organization for Migration. It's a typical legal definition, not necessarily written by anybody that got a liberal education, but It is useful. It refers to persons or groups of persons who, for reasons of sudden or progressive changes in the environment that adversely affect their lives or living conditions, are obligated to have to leave their habitual homes or choose to do so either temporarily or permanently, and to move either within their territory or abroad. Whew. Wow, okay, that's a lot. So let's just break it down piece by piece. What's really important about this is that it addresses victims of rapid onset events such as Hurricane Katrina and slow onset events such as farmers losing their land because of arid conditions getting worse. It addresses the fact that people might move across borders or within borders. In fact, people affected by extreme weather move within only 1 kilometer of their home towns, and they intend to move back as soon as possible. This definition addresses that displacement could be long-term, short-term, forced, or voluntary. People might choose to go even if they don't feel that they have to go. The good news is that we do have some legal protections, and there is practice by different countries who have actually agreed to grant some protections that we normally grant to refugees to people that are affected by extreme weather events. The principle of non-refoulement, not sending people outside of your country, you don't send them back to a country where they fear persecution. We have evidence, precedent in the US, Latin America, and Europe that people have been granted the permit to stay when weather conditions or climatic conditions in their home countries might actually make life impossible, difficult if not impossible. What's really important here is that from this legal perspective, is the nature of the harm that matters, not the cause of the harm. So whether it's climate change that's keeping people away, it's not going to carry a lot of weight. It's the fact that they can't go back because they can no longer grow food, or they can no longer have a home because it's been washed away. It's that the basic means of subsistence have actually disappeared. So the international community agreed that it's not a good idea to send people back to a place where the basic means of subsistence are no longer there. So as I mentioned, there is a number of countries that have already applied that. The bad news is that this only applies to people who find themselves in a host country when the extreme weather event happens and their home country requests help from the countries where they happen to be. But if you are in your home country and you're facing these extreme weather events, then none of these applies to you. What happens when you actually live in a country that's disappearing? And I'm talking about island states in the Pacific. And I think that's probably one of the most extreme cases of people affected by climate change. Okay, so the argument that I make is that the international community also has a decent enough foundation for us to do something to help people in those countries. The international community under public international law agreed that we all have a duty to cooperate. It's a legal obligation, it's not just a moral obligation, so it's hard law, it carries weight. So what is a state? So think about this for a moment. A state is just a piece of real estate with a few people on it, a good government that actually can engage in relations with their neighbors. International law works on the assumption that states are here for the long run, but they also understand that some states might actually go away. And we do have evidence that that's the case. If you look at the last few years, we have the Soviet Union breaking up. We have Yugoslavia breaking up. And in those cases, the international community accepts that provided that there is somebody else to pick up their obligations. That happened with Russia in the case of the Soviet Union, Serbia in the case of Yugoslavia. So what are some of those obligations? If your country disappears, you have the right to citizenship. So every country has the obligation to find you a pathway to citizenship. We have some legal basis for this. Going back to 1954, Statelessness Convention mandates that countries have to afford people citizenship and provide pathways to assimilation and naturalization. Okay, unfortunately, that has been tried in the past. So I'm going to be using these signs. I'm very proud of them. This is a joint project that I did with George Williams, and his students produced these. And I use these in my class. Some of my students in the room have used them when we study international law. So unfortunately, one of the countries that has given us experience is Nauru. The island of Nauru, the Nauruan people were almost moved 3 times in the last 50 years by the UK, because environmental conditions from so much phosphate nitrate extraction made living conditions desperate. And the British wanted to move them out so they could continue to dig, and the people of Nauru did not want to move because they were afraid to lose their sense of national identity. Again, that keeps coming back. So, what alternatives do we have? All right. So moving people is probably not necessarily an easy thing to do. So what we normally try to do is to keep them there. So when the sun is rising, when the sea is rising, what we've tended to do is actually build walls. I think we really like to build walls. This is President Mohamed Nasheed of the Maldives, looking at a wall that was built around Male, the capital, that was funded by you guys, taxpayers. So the US very kindly agreed to build the wall so they wouldn't have to leave. So the argument that I'm making is that that's probably not the best idea for a number of reasons: political, economic, maybe even geological. Walls don't necessarily stop erosion, they just displace it. So maybe that island is okay, but the one behind is probably not okay. So you just protect your government, but not necessarily the people who live further from the government, which is a terrible thing humans like to do normally. So what I propose is a new approach. It's a human rights approach. And this is something that has been based on an experiment or a project in Vanuatu. So Vanuatu is also a Pacific island state that has a lot of experience dealing with environmental challenges. So what do people in Vanuatu do when the king tide comes? They strengthen the mangroves. They don't build a wall, because they know that when they build a wall, the erosion gets displaced. You build a mangrove that actually forces the king tide to go around the island, not to different parts of the island. So what we see here is prime climate adaptation at work. Grandma and her grandson building protection against the high tides, the king tides. So a human rights approach, I contend, is one that empowers people, provides an empowering framework for right holders, and creates a framework of accountability for duty holders. We have the duty to collaborate, right? We have the duty to help people find ways to citizenship. Okay, so this human rights approach will be one that will help us build resilient communities, that will develop approaches based on traditional local knowledge. Pacific states, as I mentioned earlier, have been dealing with this problem for a long time. And what they do is that they move. They build the mangroves again, or they move if the mangroves are too young and they don't help. Building community is also more participatory. It's more democratic. It brings the people together and helps them implement the solutions that they want. Migration is not necessarily a terrible thing for people living in island states. They've done it periodically. That's how they got there in the first place. They just don't want to be removed as a nation, but they want to have the option to have some of the people move, because by having some people move, the stressors are reduced for those who stay. Historically, some people moved somewhere else to allow for conditions to improve for those who stay behind. And that's exactly what they want to do. A process of circular migration is what the people in Kiribati in particular, and unfortunately my Kiribati symbol is not doing very well. I don't know if it will stand. Let me try. Maybe with a little bit of help, whoops, from the Maldives here. All right. Okay, there it is. So Kiribati still standing, barely, but still standing. So what the government of Kiribati has done is that it's been trying to get countries to accept significant quotas of people from Kiribati. The Kiribati don't want to be moved to all countries in the world. They want to build 1 or 2 strong pockets in 1 or 2 countries so that their community can build a settlement that will bring the IKT bus with them. It will provide ethnic networks that will help the process of migration. It will facilitate a transfer of skills from the home country to the host and back, and that will be ready to, in the case that the whole country has to be evacuated, will be ready to protect the national culture. Okay, so enter New Zealand. New Zealand is actually doing this. New Zealand is the only country in the world that has a foreign policy that is trying to help promote development in the Pacific Rim, and they actually offer countries the quotas that they want. So the problem is that, look at the quotas. A country of 10,000 is probably not going to be able to move to New Zealand if all you give them is 75, quota of 75 people every year. So while New Zealand is probably doing the right thing, it probably should be a little more generous with their quotas, especially because people from a specific country would like to move to one specific country. So maybe New Zealand should open up to people from 2 or 3 island countries. Australia should open up to people from 2 or 3 island countries. Okay, all of these grassroots human rights-based approach does not negate that sometimes technology coming from the outside might be necessary. Humanitarian aid might be necessary, especially in the case of a major catastrophe. So, bringing all of this together, making all of this work will require a lot of effort from the international community and from different actors. So, here comes the United Nations with the impossible task of making all this possible, and without any money. So the UN is probably, for lack of a better option, the best umbrella that we have in the world to provide the governance structures, the coordination that we need. Because moving climate refugees requires that we bring together expertise from many, many, many different fields. Migration, environment, development, disaster risk, human rights, humanitarian aid, security. We also need a clear set of principles, and I think we do have them. The duty to cooperate is a good one. The focus on protection, especially not just the protection of life in general, the protection of the weak in particular. And I think the UNHCR, as Beth mentioned, is probably the best agency to do this, has the best experience, the longest experience. We also need to make sure that we create a framework that will help us address environmental disasters when they happen, rapid onset, but also help us protect the populations that are affected by slow onset disasters. Some of the principles guiding internal displacement might actually apply for cases of international displacement. We also have a body of international law, refugee law, humanitarian law, that we can also draw on to continue to strengthen the protections for potential victims. And I'm concluding by saying that we can't wait. The problem will only get worse. The more we wait, the worse it will be. The more expensive and more difficult the solutions will be, and we need to act as soon as possible. So I will conclude with that, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
So the panel would be happy to take your questions. I believe they want the questioners to have a microphone. Excellent.
I'm not asking a question, I'm just holding a microphone.
So, is this specifically, Pablo, for you, but really a question kind of in general is, no one's mentioning the companies that are involved in this and where their culpability is in these situations, and also making them responsible as actors to be aware of what's happening around them, and what is their, what is their moral obligation to respond, because companies are international and we all invest in stock and they support us, and they are often on the ground in a lot of these places, whether it's environmental or conflict situation.
Thank you, Nina, for that question. Well, under public international law, only states are subjects. So we all know that normally it's corporations that actually pump, greenhouse gases into the air. But under international law, whether we get corporations to do something about this or not depends on whether countries' governments require that. So if the international community decides that we need to be serious about addressing responsibility to that degree, we might be able to get there, but I just don't see countries doing this. And I think the big problem here is that we didn't know the pumping fossil fuels into the air was going to cause the problem. We do now, but we didn't know back then.
I'm speaking about much more specifically, like not that they caused it accidentally, but that they're on the ground in an open air coal mine in an area that's now arid and they're using all the water and people are dying. I've been there. So that's a situation. It's an international company. We see a lot of that, mining. So it's people being actually on the ground. The oil companies are all over the world in places where there's conflict going on, but I don't know they're addressing it. And as an example of a place where corporations are stepping in with the Aurora, am I saying it right, with the coffee blight that's going on in Latin America, because of the relationship of organic farmers to Green Mountain Roasters and Starbucks, they're actually stepping in because they have this extraordinary relationship around organic coffee that makes them know the co-ops that they're buying coffee from. So they're really proactively trying to help the people on the ground who could be displaced because of climate change in that framework that you were talking about, because this coffee blight is being caused by climate. And so, more specifically.
Yes, okay.
And I do think we have power as actors that goes beyond obligating the state to obligate the companies. I would say that. I'd put that out there in this.
Right, and I think that the issue happens mostly at the domestic level, at the national level, and should be probably fought within the national judicial system. These corporations are operating in a country and they're subject to the jurisdiction of that country. In a way that the research that I'm doing now, it goes along these lines. So I'm doing a comparative study of different countries in Latin America. The problem with that is that there is the law, and then there is the sociology of the law, and then there is legal anthropology, and there is legal economics. So it's a number of variables that come into play. How do you really get companies to internalize those externalities? That is the challenge. You have to find, a chain of causality. You have to be able to, do proper environmental accounting to be able to quantify the amount of damage that was done. And if we manage to do that, the argument goes, then let's stop doing it. But the fact that we don't have a good way to do that allows them to lower production costs by externalizing all of these, problems that then the society has to pay for. So I'm really with you on that. I don't really have a good answer.
That was a good answer.
Okay.
Enforcement's hard.
Excuse me. My question is actually twofold, one for Pablo and one for whoever else wants to answer. The first question is, the dangerous or reckless acts that are coming out of the current administration when it comes to the EPA, how bad do you think that's going to bring us back as far as fossil fuels emissions? And do you think that they could ratchet, or China's going to ratchet up their emissions as well? And the other side of the equation is the dangerous rhetoric that's come out of the current campaign or the current presidency in regards to funding the UN. He is totally against funding it to the capacities that we funded it in the past. How is that going to impact everything that's going on in all three of your presentations?
All right. The EPA question, the current administration and climate change. So I think the most diplomatic answer that I can provide is that Americans are less important to the world than they think they are. So whatever the US does is important, but it's probably not going to be as important as what China does, India, probably Indonesia, how they're addressing the issue of palm oil and deforestation. So we do have a number of countries that are contributing to climate change in really important ways. China is already producing more emissions than the US, India is catching up, and we have all of these countries that are contributing in different ways. Regardless of what the administration does, and I'm not really endorsing what they do, and I think there is a lot of really real problems with this, but coal is really not coming back. Those jobs are probably not coming back. I mean, coal mining is very efficient. It doesn't need as many jobs as it did back in the 1940s and 50s. Even though coal production has doubled, I think the amount of jobs in the coal industry in the US is only about 15 or 20% of what it was, which is a great evidence of good technology. But demand for coal in this country is declining and will continue to decline. I think only 10 years ago, coal accounted for about 45% of the energy mix in this country. Is now down to less than 1/3 and continues to fall, mostly due to the transition from coal to natural gas. Our power plants are producing energy by burning natural gas, which was made available to us thanks to fracking technology. So here you have it. Lots of environmental problems with fracking, but it's actually turning out to be positive for the US to lower emissions in the short run. It's not a long-term solution, but it's certainly helping in the short run. When corporations make plans for a new power plant, they don't really look at the next 4 years. I really doubt anybody's going to build a coal power plant in the next 4 years. They look at 25 to 50 years, depending on what sort of energy we're looking at. And coal is really a thing of the past. It's really not going to come back. So in that sense, I think we should worry less about the impact of the current administration on climate change than I think most of us tend to think. So I'll leave it there.
So the second part of your question had to do with the UN and America defunding it or defunding what we...
Trump's made some comments on numerous occasions about not contributing as much money to the UN as we have been, and is now placing the burden on other countries
Right.
To take our share up.
Right. I think what we're seeing, again, I kind of agree that Americans aren't as important as they think they are. And so there are systems in place already that are international organizations, and they're already moving forward. And I think that if we fall behind, there are lots of people to take up that vacuum in all different kinds of sectors, actually. But what we see happening in Europe as well politically is that the conservative right is also on the rise. So France has its presidential elections coming up in April as well, and Marine Le Pen is way further along than everyone thought she would be. But there's also hope that we're distanced enough from Trump taking office to see some real consequences, and I think that this is important in France. And so I know that there are lots of people who aren't going to vote in the first round in France because they're fed up with the entire system. But eventually, I'm hoping that they're not going to vote for her. That if we keep going in this direction where America keeps losing out, that other countries are going to realize that this is the case, and the voting populations will actually take matters into their own hands and go out, even if they're disgusted with what's going on, to make a difference. Yeah.
I'm actually going to disagree with my colleagues a little bit because I think on the refugee issue, the United States is a critical player on this. The UNHCR gets the vast majority of its funding from the United States. And if the the UNHCR doesn't get enough money to begin with, if the US pulls back on that, that will be very serious. Also, even though the United States doesn't resettle that many refugees, when you think about how many refugees need to be resettled, it does resettle a large number compared to other countries. And the possibility that the United States could shut down its refugee program, I think that is a serious threat, and it is a betrayal of American history and values.